The evening air hung thick and warm over the city, the kind of humidity that clings to your skin like a second layer of clothing. Streetlights flickered on one by one as dusk settled in, casting long shadows across sidewalks still radiating the day's heat. A few blocks from the public library, a young woman walked with quiet purpose, earbuds nestled in her ears, the faintest hum of a classical piano piece barely audible beneath the distant rush of traffic. She carried a stack of thick books pressed against her chest, legal textbooks with dog-eared pages and underlined passages, and wore a simple hoodie over a plain t-shirt, jeans, and well-worn sneakers. Nothing about her stood out, nothing screamed for attention. She was just another person heading home after a long day of studying, her mind still tangled in arguments about constitutional law and precedent. But to two officers cruising slowly in an unmarked sedan with tinted windows, she didn't look like just another person. She looked like a problem. They'd been patrolling the neighborhood for hours, bored and restless, their radio chatter growing increasingly sarcastic. Earlier that day, a vague bulletin had gone out about a possible suspect in a minor theft, a person matching general description, which in practice meant almost nothing. But boredom has a way of turning vague into certain and suspicion into action. When they spotted her walking alone, shoulders slightly hunched under the weight of her books, they slowed the car without saying a word to each other. Something about her posture, or maybe just the color of her skin against the fading light, triggered a response they couldn't quite name, but didn't question either. The car rolled to a stop beside her. One officer stepped out, his hand resting casually near his belt. "Hey," he called, voice sharp enough to cut through her music. She pulled one earbud out, startled but not panicked. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice calm, eyes steady. "Where you headed?" the officer asked, not answering her question. "Home," she said, glancing toward the street ahead. "Just came from the library." He nodded slowly, but his eyes didn't soften. "Got any ID on you?" She hesitated for just a second, long enough to register that this wasn't a routine hello, but something else. Still, she reached into her back pocket and pulled out her wallet. "Sure," she said, handing over her driver's license. The officer took it without a word, studied it under the glow of his flashlight, then passed it to his partner, who had now stepped out of the car as well. For a moment, the street was quiet except for the low hum of the idling engine and the distant laughter of kids playing a few blocks away. She stood there waiting, not fidgeting, not arguing. She'd been taught from a young age how to handle encounters like this. Stay polite, keep your hands visible, don't raise your voice. Her grandmother had drilled it into her. They'll look for any reason to make you seem guilty. Don't give them one, but sometimes no reason is needed. The first officer handed back her license but didn't step away. "You live around here?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "Couple blocks down? You go to school?" "Law school," she said simply. That seemed to catch him off guard for a split second. Maybe it was the confidence in her tone, or the way she held herself, but then his expression hardened again. "Mind if we take a quick look in your bag?" She blinked. "My bag? It's just books." "Standard procedure," the second officer said, stepping closer. He was taller, broader, with a voice that carried the weight of authority even when it wasn't justified. "We're just checking for safety." She knew she could say no. Legally, they needed reasonable suspicion to search her, and so far they hadn't given her any. But saying no could make things worse. She'd seen videos, read reports, heard stories from friends. Sometimes no becomes resisting. So she nodded slowly. "All right." The taller officer reached for her backpack, unzipped it, and began pulling out books one by one, flipping through pages as if expecting contraband to fall out. He set them on the sidewalk with little care, their spines cracking against the concrete. She winced but said nothing. Then he moved to her jacket pockets. Front empty, back empty. Then with a slight pause, his hand dipped into the inside lining of her hoodie. And that's when everything changed. "Got something here," he announced, pulling out a small, clear plastic baggie. It held what looked like marijuana. Just a pinch, really, but enough. Her stomach dropped. "That's not mine," she said immediately, voice firmer now. "I don't use that." "I've never even touched it," the first officer smirked. "Sure you haven't. I'm telling you, I didn't put that there. I don't even have an inside pocket like that." But they weren't listening anymore. The discovery had shifted the energy on the street. From suspicion to certainty, from questioning to accusation. Within minutes, her hands were cuffed behind her back, her books left scattered on the pavement, her earbuds crushed under a boot. She asked to call someone, but they told her she'd get her phone call at the station. As they guided her into the back of the car, she caught a glimpse of a neighbor watching from a porch across the street, eyes wide, phone in hand. She hoped they were recording. At the precinct, things moved quickly and coldly. She gave her name, repeated that she was a federal prosecutor, but the desk sergeant just chuckled. Right, and I'm the governor. They processed her like any other arrest, fingerprints, mugshot, booking questions. She sat in a holding cell for hours on a hard metal bench, listening to the muffled sounds of the station, shouting, doors slamming, radios crackling. Her mind raced, not with fear but with strategy. She knew the system. She knew how these things could spiral if you didn't act fast. But she also knew that her title wouldn't mean much here. Not tonight, not to these officers. To them, she was just another black teenager they'd caught. When she finally got to make a call, she dialed a number from memory, not her family, not a friend, but her supervising attorney in Washington. DC, the call went to voicemail. She left a calm, precise message. It's me. I've been arrested in Atlanta on false charges. Officers planted evidence. I need you to contact the U.S. Attorney's Office here immediately. Tell them it's urgent. She hung up, took a deep breath, and leaned her head against the cool cinder block wall. Outside, the night deepened. Somewhere, her grandmother was probably wondering why she hadn't come home. She pictured the older woman sitting by the window, waiting, worrying, praying. The thought tightened her chest. Back in the interrogation room, the officers returned. They offered her a deal. Admit to possession, get probation, go home tomorrow. First-time offender, one said almost kindly as if he were doing her a favor. Don't make this harder than it has to be. She looked him in the eye. I didn't do anything wrong. He sighed, exchanged a glance with his partner, and stood up. Suit yourself. They left her alone again. But this time, something had shifted in her. The calm wasn't just composure anymore, it was resolve. She wasn't just a victim of a bad stop. She was a witness to something deeper, something systemic. And she had the training, the knowledge, and now, the personal stake to do something about it. The next morning, after a sleepless night on a thin mat in a crowded cell, she was brought before a judge for arraignment. The local public defender assigned to her case, a tired-looking man with coffee stains on his tie, whispered urgently, "Take the deal. It's your best shot." But she shook her head. "I'm not pleading guilty to something I didn't do." The judge set bail. Her grandmother, frail but determined, showed up with cash saved from her pension. When they finally hugged outside the courthouse, the older woman didn't say much, just held her tightly, her hands trembling slightly. "I knew," she whispered. "I knew they were lying." Back home, showered and wrapped in a blanket, the young woman sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of legal books her grandmother had retrieved from the libraries lost and found. The city outside carried on as if nothing had happened. Cars passed. Birds chirped. Neighbors waved from their yards. But everything felt different now. She had walked into that evening as a student, a granddaughter, a quiet presence in her community. She walked out as someone who had seen the machinery of injustice up close, and who knew, better than most, how to dismantle it. She opened her laptop, logged into her federal email, and began drafting a formal complaint. Not angry, not emotional, just facts, times, names, inconsistencies. She attached the case numbers, referenced relevant statutes, cited department policies. Then she hit send and waited because she knew this wasn't over. The arrest was just the beginning. The real battle, the one for truth, for accountability, for the countless others who never got a second chance, was just getting started. And this time, she wouldn't be the one in cuffs. She'd be the one asking the questions. The days after her release blurred together in a strange mix of exhaustion and hyper-alertness. She moved through her grandmother's small house like a ghost, quiet, careful, trying not to add to the worry already etched into the older woman's face. Her grandmother didn't say much, but every time she brought her a cup of tea or adjusted the blanket on the couch, her eyes lingered a second too long, as if making sure she was really there, really safe. That silent vigilance was more comforting than any words could have been. But comfort wasn't enough. Not when the weight of what had happened pressed down on her chest like a stone. She knew the system well enough to understand that being let out on bail didn't mean she was free. The charge still hung over her, a smudge on her record, a shadow in every room she entered. And worse, the officers who'd stopped her were still out there, wearing their badges, writing reports, making more stops. She couldn't let that stand. Her first move was to file a formal complaint with the city's Internal Affairs Division. She typed it out late one night at the kitchen table, the only sound the soft click of keys and the hum of the refrigerator. She kept it factual. Time of stop, officer descriptions, vehicle details, the exact sequence of events. She noted the missing front pockets on her hoodie, the lack of probable cause, the sudden appearance of drugs that hadn't been there before. She even included the name of the street vendor she'd passed just before the stop, someone she hoped might have seen something. But filing a complaint was one thing. Getting someone to take it seriously was another. The next morning, she met with the court-appointed attorney assigned to her criminal case. He was a kind man, she could tell, but worn thin by years of overwork and underfunding. His office was cramped, papers stacked haphazardly on every surface, and he barely looked up when she walked in. He skimmed her file, sighed, and leaned back in his creaky chair. "Look," he said gently, "I get it. You feel wronged. But this is how it goes sometimes. They've got a baggie with your name on the arrest report, body cam footage that's partially corrupted, and 2 officers swearing under oath that they found it on you. Unless you've got a miracle witness or a confession, the DA's going to push for a plea. And honestly, taking a deal might be your best shot." She sat very still. "I didn't do anything wrong." "I believe you," he said, and she thought he meant it. "But the system doesn't run on belief. It runs on evidence, and right now their evidence looks stronger than yours." That stung, not because it was harsh, but because it was true. She had truth on her side, but truth doesn't always show up in court dressed in admissible form. She needed more. So she thanked him, stood up, and walked out with a new kind of clarity. If no one was going to fight for her, she'd have to build the case herself. She started by retracing her steps. She went back to the library, then walked the exact route she'd taken that night. She found the street vendor, a man who sold roasted corn from a cart near the corner, still in his usual spot. At first he was wary. "I don't get involved in police stuff," he muttered, eyes darting toward the street. But when she showed him her ID, not her driver's license, but her federal credentials, he paused. He studied her face, then the badge, then back again. "You're really a prosecutor?" he asked, voice low. "Yes," she said, "and I need your help." He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I saw it," he admitted. "Not the whole thing, but enough. Those cops circled your block 3 times before they stopped you, like they were waiting. And when they searched you, I saw one of them reach into his own pocket real quick before going into your jacket." Her heart leapt. "Did you record any of it?" He pulled out his phone. "I film my cart sometimes for security. Didn't think much of it that night, but..." He scrolled, tapped, and handed her the screen. There it was, grainy, shaky, but unmistakable. The unmarked car driving past, then turning around. Her walking calmly, head down, reading as she walked. Then the stop. And yes, just before the officer patted her down, his hand dipped into his own coat. It wasn't perfect footage. The audio was muffled, the angle awkward. But it was something. Real. Tangible. She thanked him profusely, offered to pay, but he waved her off. "Just make sure they don't do this to someone else who can't fight back," he said quietly. Next, she tracked down the city's traffic camera logs. It took 3 calls, 2 dead ends, and a favor from a former classmate who worked in municipal tech. But eventually, she got access to the footage from the intersection near her stop. The timestamp matched. The video showed her walking alone, books in hand, no deviation from her path. Crucially, it also showed she never entered the alley the officers later claimed she'd been lurking in. The same alley where, according to their report, they observed suspicious behavior before initiating the stop. She printed everything. Made copies, organized timelines, cross-referenced patrol logs. She even dug into the officers' histories through public records and found 2 prior complaints. One for falsifying a search warrant affidavit, another for excessive force during a traffic stop. Both had been unfounded after internal review, but the patterns were there, faint but visible to someone who knew where to look. She sent all of it to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Atlanta, along with a follow-up to her original complaint. This time she included a line that wasn't in the first draft. "This isn't just about me. It's about what happens to the next person they decide looks suspicious," but the local DA's office remained unmoved. When her attorney checked in with the prosecutor handling her case, the response was firm. "We stand by our officers. The evidence is solid. We're moving forward." That's when she realized something important. Trying to convince the local system to correct itself might be futile. These were the same people who worked side by side with the police every day, shared coffee, closed cases together, relied on each other's testimony. Asking them to turn on their own was like asking a family to disown one of its own at the dinner table. Possible, but unlikely. So she shifted tactics. Instead of fighting to get the charges dropped quietly, she decided to let the case go to trial. Not because she wanted to risk a conviction, she didn't, but because the courtroom was the one place where everything had to be said out loud, under oath in front of a judge and a jury, and, if she played it right, the public. If she could get the truth on the record, if she could force the officers to explain how drugs appeared in a jacket with no pocket, if she could show the video, the camera logs, the pattern of behavior, then maybe, just maybe, the system would have no choice but to respond. But going to trial meant staying in the city longer than planned. It meant more stress for her grandmother, more missed work in D.C., more sleepless nights staring at the ceiling. It also meant facing the possibility, however small, that a jury might believe the officers over her. That fear was real, and it gnawed at her in quiet moments, but every time it surfaced, she remembered the street vendor's words. Make sure they don't do this to someone else. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. Meanwhile, word had started to spread in the neighborhood, not loudly, not on social media. She'd been careful to avoid that, knowing how easily things could spiral. But through hushed conversations at the grocery store, church gatherings, front porches. People who'd known her since she was a child couldn't believe what they were hearing. That girl? With drugs? Never. But others weren't so sure. The arrest report was public. The mugshot was out there. And in a world where perception often trumps truth, doubt had already taken root. Her grandmother bore the brunt of it. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped her on the sidewalk. "I heard about your granddaughter," she said, voice laced with pity. "Such a shame. She seemed like such a good kid." The older woman didn't flinch. "She is a good kid," she said firmly. "And she's telling the truth. You'll see." Back home, she told her granddaughter what had happened. They sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around mugs of chamomile tea, the silence between them heavy but not sad. "They don't know you like I do," her grandmother said finally. "But soon everyone will." That night, she called her supervising attorney again. This time, he answered. She laid out everything: the vendor's video, the traffic cam, the officer's history, the DA's refusal to drop the case. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You're sure about this?" he asked. "I've never been more sure of anything." He exhaled slowly. "All right. I'll reach out to the Civil Rights Division, and I'll notify the FBI field office in Atlanta. But you understand, this could get messy." "I know," she said, "but messy is better than silent." In the days that followed, small signs of movement began to appear. A federal investigator called, asking for copies of her evidence. Internal Affairs scheduled a formal interview. Even her court-appointed attorney seemed more attentive, less resigned. "Something's shifting," he told her after a pre-trial hearing. "The DA's office is nervous, but the officers? They acted like nothing had happened. They showed up to court dates in crisp uniforms, gave curt nods to the prosecutors, avoided looking in her direction. Once, in the hallway outside the courtroom, one of them passed close enough that she could smell his cologne. He didn't say a word, but his eyes flicked toward her, cold, unreadable. It wasn't fear. It was confidence. The kind that comes from years of never being held accountable. That look stayed with her. Not because it scared her, but because it confirmed what she already suspected. This wasn't just about one bad stop. It was about a culture that protected its own, no matter the cost. And if she was going to break through it, she'd need more than evidence. She'd need a moment, a single, undeniable moment where the truth couldn't be ignored. She just didn't know yet where that moment would come. But she was ready for it, because now every step she took, every document she filed, every quiet conversation she had, was part of a larger plan. She wasn't just preparing for trial. She was setting a stage. And when the time came, she wouldn't just defend herself. She'd expose everything. The city kept turning. The sun rose and set. People went to work. came home, lived their lives. But beneath the surface, something was building. A storm, maybe, or a reckoning. Either way, it was coming. And she would be standing right in the center of it, calm, clear-eyed, and ready to speak. The morning after the latest pretrial hearing, she woke before sunrise. Not because she couldn't sleep, though that had become normal, but because her mind was already racing ahead, mapping out the next move like pieces on a chessboard. She sat at the kitchen table with a steaming mug of black coffee, the kind her grandmother always warned was too strong for someone so young, and spread out her notes across the worn wood surface. Photos, printouts, timelines, scribbled questions. Each sheet was a thread in a web she was carefully weaving, one that she hoped would finally trap the truth. She'd spent the last week doing what she did best, digging. Not loudly, not recklessly, but with the quiet precision of someone who understood how systems work and how they break. She'd called in favors from old law school contacts, reached out to civil rights attorneys who'd handled similar cases, even tracked down a retired police sergeant known for blowing the whistle on misconduct years ago. Most were cautious, wary of getting involved in something that could stir up local tensions. But a few listened, and one, a soft-spoken woman who now ran a legal aid nonprofit, offered something invaluable: access to a private investigator who specialized in police accountability cases. The investigator, a former journalist turned fact-finder with tired eyes and a dry sense of humor, met her at a quiet diner on the edge of town. Over scrambled eggs and weak coffee, he listened without interrupting as she laid out everything: the stop, the planted evidence, the missing footage, the officers' histories. When she finished, he didn't offer sympathy. He just nodded and said, "All right, let's see what they don't want us to see." What followed was a slow, methodical unraveling of the official story. The investigator started with the body cam footage. On the surface, it showed the stop, the questioning, the search. But when he ran it through forensic enhancement software, he found something odd: a 47-second gap right at the moment the officer reached into her jacket. The department claimed it was a technical malfunction, but the investigator noticed something else. The audio didn't cut out cleanly. There was a faint click, then silence, then another click, the kind of edit you'd make if you were splicing footage. He also pulled maintenance logs for the cruiser's dash cam. According to records, the system had been serviced the day after her arrest, unusual for a vehicle that hadn't been in an accident. And when he cross-referenced patrol logs, he found that the two officers had been assigned to a different district that night. They'd requested a temporary reassignment just hours before the stop, citing community outreach. No supervisor had signed off on it. It was, for all practical purposes, an unsanctioned patrol. Meanwhile, she focused on the human side of the case. She visited the street vendor again, this time with a notarized statement for him to sign. He hesitated at first, afraid of retaliation, afraid of becoming a target. But when she explained that his testimony could protect others, he agreed. "My nephew walks these streets every day," he said quietly. "I don't want him to end up like you." She also tracked down a woman who lived in the apartment above the alley the officers claimed she'd been lurking in. The woman, a night shift nurse, remembered hearing the cruiser idling below around the time of the stop, but she never saw anyone in the alley. "It was empty," she said firmly. "I looked out my window because the engine was so loud. Each new detail was a brick in the wall she was building against the lie." But the most surprising discovery came from an unexpected source: a former dispatcher who'd retired 6 months earlier. Through a mutual acquaintance, the woman agreed to talk. Off the record, no names, just facts. She recalled the night of the arrest vividly because the radio traffic had been unusually tense. One of the officers called in a 1098, that's code for suspicious person, but he didn't give a description. Then, 10 minutes later, he called in the arrest with full details. It was like he made up the reason after the fact. That was the kind of inconsistency that didn't show up in reports, the kind only someone inside the system would notice. Armed with this new information, she went back to her attorney. This time, he didn't sigh. He leaned forward, eyes sharp. "This changes things," he admitted. "If we can prove the stop was pretextual, and that evidence was planted, we might not just get the charges dropped. We could get the officers charged, but the local DA's office still wouldn't budge." When her attorney formally requested a dismissal based on the new evidence, the response was curt. "The state stands by its case. Trial will proceed as scheduled. That was the moment she made her decision. If they wouldn't drop the charges, she wouldn't let them hide behind procedure. She would force the truth into the open, on the witness stand in front of a judge under oath. She knew it was risky. Testifying in your own defense always is. But she also knew something the officers didn't. She wasn't just any defendant. She understood courtroom dynamics, evidentiary rules, the weight of cross-examination. And she had one advantage they couldn't anticipate: credibility. Not because of her title, but because of how she carried herself. Calm, consistent, unshaken. She began preparing for trial like it was a final exam she couldn't afford to fail. She rehearsed her testimony with her attorney, not to memorize lines, but to stay grounded in facts. She reviewed every document, every timestamp, every contradiction. She even practiced staying composed when asked provocative questions. Why would two officers risk their careers to frame you? Or isn't it possible you just forgot the drugs were in your pocket? She knew those questions would come, and she'd be ready. Her grandmother watched all this with quiet pride. She didn't understand legal jargon or evidentiary standards, but she understood her granddaughter's heart. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies blink in the dusk, she said, "You're not just doing this for yourself, are you?" "No," the young woman replied softly. "I'm doing it for everyone they've done this to, and everyone they'll do it to if no one stops them." The older woman reached over and squeezed her hand. "Then I'll be there, front row." As the trial date drew closer, small ripples began to spread through the city. A local reporter, tipped off by a source in the public defender's office, started asking questions. Not aggressively, just enough to make people nervous. The police union issued a statement defending the officers' professional conduct. The local news ran a brief segment about the upcoming trial, careful to present it as a he said, she said situation. But online, in community forums and neighborhood groups, the conversation was shifting. People were talking, wondering, remembering their own encounters with law enforcement. And then, 3 days before jury selection, something unexpected happened. A junior officer from the same precinct, a young woman who'd only been on the force for a year, showed up at her attorney's office. She wouldn't give her name, wouldn't stay long, but she left a sealed envelope. Inside was a handwritten note and a USB drive. The note read, "I heard what they did to you. I've seen them do it before. This is what they don't want anyone to see." The drive contained internal training materials, slides, from a department seminar on field discretion that included troubling language about using minor charges to establish control in high-risk neighborhoods. It wasn't direct proof of her case, but it showed a culture that normalized bending the rules. More importantly, it came from inside. Her attorney stared at the screen for a long time before saying, "This could be the turning point." But she wasn't celebrating yet. She knew better than to trust momentum. In the legal world, momentum can vanish with one bad ruling, one skeptical judge, one juror who decides to believe the badge over the person. So she kept working, kept preparing, kept reminding herself why she was doing this. The night before jury selection, she sat alone in her room, reviewing her opening statement one last time. Outside, the city hummed with its usual rhythm. Cars passing, distant music, the occasional dog barking. Normal life, continuing as if nothing extraordinary was about to happen. But she knew better. Tomorrow, she would walk into that courtroom not as a victim, not as a defendant, but as a witness to what happened to her, and to what happens every day to people who don't have her voice, her training, her chance to be heard. She closed her notebook, turned off the lamp, and sat in the dark for a long time. Not afraid, not angry, just ready, because the quiet rebellion she'd started weeks ago was about to step into the light, and this time the truth wouldn't be whispered. It would be spoken loud enough for everyone to hear. The courthouse buzzed with a tension that felt almost physical, like the air before a summer storm. People filled the hallway, reporters with notepads, curious neighbors, a few uniformed officers standing near the back with arms crossed, their faces unreadable. Inside the courtroom, every seat was taken. Even the overflow benches along the walls were full. It wasn't just another drug possession case anymore. Something about the way it had unfolded, the quiet persistence of the accused, the rumors swirling online, the sudden interest from federal authorities, had turned it into something more. A test, a reckoning. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. She walked in calmly, dressed in a simple navy suit, her hair pulled back, her expression steady. She didn't look at the officers seated at the prosecution's table. She didn't scan the crowd for familiar faces. She just moved to her seat beside her attorney, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the judge's bench. Her grandmother sat in the front row, back straight, hands clasped tightly around a worn leather Bible. She didn't cry. She didn't fidget. She just sat there, a quiet pillar of strength. The trial began like any other. The prosecutor, a seasoned assistant district attorney with a reputation for closing cases quickly, laid out his argument with practiced ease. He described the stop as routine, the discovery of drugs as unfortunate but clear, and the arrest as by the book. He played the edited body cam footage. Pausing at the moment the officer pulled the baggie from her jacket. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, turning to the jury, "the evidence speaks for itself." Her attorney didn't object. Not yet. He let the prosecutor build his house of cards, knowing it would be easier to knock down once it was fully standing. Then came the officer's testimony. The first one took the stand with the confidence of someone who'd done this many times before. He spoke in short, clipped sentences, sticking to the report word for word. Yes, he'd seen her acting nervously. Yes, she'd been near the alley. Yes, the drugs were in her front pocket. When asked if he'd ever falsified evidence, he looked mildly offended. "Absolutely not. I take my oath seriously." Her attorney's cross-examination was careful at first, almost gentle. He asked about the patrol logs, the unsanctioned reassignment, the missing 47 seconds of footage. The officer dismissed each point as administrative errors or technical glitches. But then came the question that changed everything. "Officer, does the defendant's hoodie have a front pocket?" The man paused. Just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "I believe it did." Her attorney held up a photo. The same hoodie laid flat on a table, clearly showing no front pockets at all, just a kangaroo pouch and an interior lining. "Is this the jacket you searched?" "Yes." "Then where exactly was this front pocket you found the drugs in?" The officer shifted in his seat. "Maybe I misspoke. It was inside the lining. But your report says front right pocket, under penalty of perjury." "I might have written it wrong." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor leaned forward, jaw tight. Then her attorney played the street vendor's video. Grainy, yes, but clear enough to show her walking calmly. Books in hand, no deviation, no alley, no nervous glances. And then, the critical moment. The officer reaching into his own coat just before searching her. "Is that your hand, officer?" The man stared at the screen, face pale. I don't recall." "You don't recall putting your hand in your own pocket seconds before claiming to find drugs in hers?" "I can't say for sure." It was the kind of answer that sounded innocent to some. But to anyone who understood human behavior, it screamed guilt. Denial would have been cleaner. Confusion was a shield. The second officer fared no better. Under questioning, he contradicted his partner about the time of the stop, the reason for the detention, even the color of her backpack. When shown the traffic camera footage proving she never entered the alley, he claimed he must have confused her with someone else. But the damage was done. The story was falling apart thread by thread. Then came the moment no one expected. Her attorney stood, turned to the judge and said, "Your Honor, the defense calls the defendant to the stand." A hush fell over the room. Defendants rarely testify in criminal cases. Too risky, too easy for prosecutors to twist words. But she rose without hesitation, walked to the witness box and raised her right hand. She answered the first few questions simply. Her name, her age, where she lived. Then her attorney asked, "What were you doing on the night of your arrest?" "I was walking home from the public library," she said, voice clear and steady. "I'd been studying for an upcoming case review. I had my legal textbooks with me. Did you have any drugs on you?" "No, I've never used illegal drugs. I don't even drink." "Did you consent to the search?" "I didn't refuse, but I didn't agree either. I knew refusing might make things worse. And when the officer pulled out the baggie, what did you think?" "I knew it wasn't mine. And I knew how it got there." The prosecutor objected. "Speculation." But the judge overruled him. "She may answer." She took a breath. I've studied the law long enough to know how these things happen. When someone decides you're guilty before they even speak to you, they'll find a way to make it stick. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Then came the question everyone had been waiting for. "Ms. Johnson, what is your profession?" She paused. Not for drama, but because she knew this moment would change everything. "I'm an assistant United States attorney," she said. "I was sworn in 3 months before my arrest. I work in the federal prosecutor's office in Washington, D.C. For a full 3 seconds, silence. Then gasps, whispers. One of the officers dropped his pen. The judge removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes as if trying to reset reality. The prosecutor stared at her like he'd just seen a ghost. Her attorney didn't smile. He just nodded. "Thank you." Recess was called immediately. In the hallway, chaos erupted. Reporters scrambled for phones. Officers huddled in tense conversation. Her grandmother stood quietly by the water fountain, tears finally spilling over. But she was smiling. Back in chambers, the judge summoned both attorneys. Within an hour, the district attorney himself arrived, sweating through his shirt. He met with her attorney behind closed doors. When they emerged, he approached her, extended his hand, and said, "We're moving to dismiss all charges." But she didn't take his hand. "With prejudice?" she asked. He hesitated. "We can discuss that." "No," she said gently but firmly. "If you dismiss without prejudice, they can refile. And they will. They'll just say it was a mistake. But this wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. So I object to dismissal unless it's with prejudice, and unless the officers return to the stand for further cross-examination." The DA looked stunned. "You want to keep going?" "I want the full truth on the record," she said. "Not just for me, for everyone who's been through this and never got a courtroom." The judge, after a long pause, agreed. The trial would continue. When court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The jury sat up straighter. The officers looked like they wanted to disappear. And this time, when her attorney questioned them again, there was no softness, only precision. He played the retired dispatcher's notes. He showed the internal training slides about using minor charges to establish control. He presented the maintenance logs proving the dash cam was tampered with after the fact. And then he asked the final question. "Officer Reeves, did you plant that baggie in her jacket?" The man didn't answer at first. His partner stared at the floor. The silence stretched so long the judge finally said, "You must answer." I don't remember," Reeves mumbled. "That's not what you told your partner in the cruiser," her attorney said, and played a clip from the unedited audio recovered from the car's backup system, a recording the department didn't know existed. In it, Reeves could be heard saying, "She looked clean, but we needed a win. Just tuck it in real quick." The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel. "Order, order!" But the damage was irreversible. The lie was out, naked, undeniable. By the end of the day, the charges were dismissed with prejudice, meaning they could never be brought again. Federal marshals arrived to escort the two officers out, not in handcuffs yet, but under investigation. The local police chief issued a statement promising a full and transparent review. The news vans multiplied outside the courthouse, but she didn't stay for the cameras. She walked out the side entrance with her grandmother, arm linked with the older woman's, both of them silent for a long time. Finally, her grandmother said, "You did it." "No," she replied softly. "We did it. Everyone who spoke up. Everyone who remembered. Everyone who refused to look away." That night she didn't celebrate. She sat on the porch again, watching the same fireflies, listening to the same quiet hum of the neighborhood. But everything felt different. Not because she'd won, though she had, but because she'd proven something deeper. That truth, when spoken clearly and backed by courage, can still cut through even the thickest walls of denial. And in a world that often feels broken, that was enough. For now, the days after the trial didn't feel like victory. Not the kind with cheers and confetti anyway. There was relief, yes, a deep, bone-level unclenching of muscles that had been tensed for weeks. But mostly there was quiet, a heavy, thoughtful quiet that settled over the house like morning fog. She spent long hours sitting on the back porch with her grandmother, sipping tea, watching birds flit between the trees, neither of them needing to say much. Sometimes the older woman would reach over and squeeze her hand, as if to make sure she was still there, still whole. And she was. But she wasn't the same. Nothing like that leaves you unchanged. News of the case spread faster than anyone expected. Not because she gave interviews, she didn't, but because the truth once spoken in open court has a way of echoing. Local news covered the dismissal, the federal investigation, the officers placed on administrative leave. National outlets picked it up too, framing it as a rare instance of accountability in a system that rarely offers any. But she stayed out of the spotlight. She knew how quickly stories like hers could be twisted, sanitized, or turned into spectacle. This wasn't about fame. It was about fairness. And fairness doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs to be real. Within a month, the Department of Justice opened a civil rights investigation into the two officers. Internal Affairs followed with its own probe, and soon both men were indicted on charges of evidence tampering, false imprisonment, and deprivation of rights under color of law. It wasn't just her word against theirs anymore. The street vendor's video, the traffic cam, the recovered audio, the training documents, it all formed a mosaic too clear to ignore. For once, the system didn't look away. But even as the legal machinery turned, she found herself thinking less about the officers and more about everyone else. The people who never made it to a courtroom. The ones who took the plea deal because they couldn't afford bail. The ones who didn't have a federal badge or a law degree or a grandmother who believed in them without question. How many of them had been stopped, searched, silenced, just because they looked suspicious to someone with a badge and a bad day? That question wouldn't let her go. She'd planned to return to Washington, D.C., resume her work, slip back into the rhythm of briefs and hearings and late-night case reviews. But something held her in the city a little longer. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was purpose. Or maybe it was just the quiet voice inside that kept whispering, "You got a chance. Now use it." So she said yes when a local community center asked if she'd speak at a youth forum on justice and policing. Not as a prosecutor, she told them, but as someone who'd been on the other side of the system. The night of the event, the room was packed, not with reporters or officials, but with teenagers, parents, elders, people who'd lived this reality long before her case made headlines. She didn't give a speech. She told a story. Her story. The fear, the confusion, the resolve. And then she listened, really listened as others shared theirs. A boy talked about being followed in stores. A mother described teaching her son how to hold his hands on the steering wheel during traffic stops. An older man recalled being arrested for loitering outside his own apartment building decades ago. Their voices weren't loud, but they were steady. And together, they painted a picture far bigger than one courtroom. One arrest, one verdict. Afterward, a girl about 16 approached her, eyes wide but determined. "I want to be a lawyer," she said softly, "but I keep hearing it's not for people like me." She looked at the girl, saw the same fire she'd once felt, the same doubt trying to smother it, and said, "Then let's prove them wrong together." That was how it started. Not with a grand plan, but with a promise. She began meeting with the girl once a week, helping her with reading comprehension, explaining legal concepts in plain language, showing her how to research cases online. She didn't call it mentoring. She called it studying together. But it was more than that. It was passing the torch not as a symbol, but as a tool. Her grandmother watched all this with quiet joy. "You're planting seeds," she said one evening, as they folded laundry in the living room. "And you won't be here to see them grow. But someone will." She knew her grandmother was right. She couldn't stay forever. Her job in D.C. was waiting. But before she left, she worked with local advocates to create a small legal literacy program for high school students. Workshops on knowing your rights, understanding the justice system, recognizing when power is being misused. It wasn't a fix. It wasn't even close to justice. But it was a start. And sometimes a start is the most powerful thing there is. The morning she packed her bags, the sky was clear and bright. Her grandmother stood in the doorway, arms crossed, smiling through tears. "You'll come back," she said. It wasn't a question. "Every chance I get," she replied. At the airport, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt tired, grateful, and deeply aware of how lucky she'd been, not because she'd done anything extraordinary, but because she'd had the resources, the knowledge, the support to fight back. Most people don't. And that truth sat with her like a stone in her chest even as the plane lifted into the sky. Back in D.C., Her colleagues welcomed her with respect, not pity. They'd followed the case. Some admitted they'd held their breath the whole time. Her supervisor pulled her aside one afternoon and said, "You didn't just defend yourself. You exposed a pattern. That matters," but she didn't want praise. She wanted change. So she started pushing from within. She advocated for more federal oversight in local policing cases. She volunteered for civil rights task forces. She used her experience to train new prosecutors on implicit bias, on the weight of a badge, on the difference between enforcing the law and weaponizing it. She spoke quietly, but she spoke often, and slowly others began to listen. Months later, she received a letter. Not an email, a real letter handwritten on lined notebook paper. It was from the girl she'd been tutoring. "I got into the summer law camp you told me about," it read. "They said I asked the best questions. I told them I had a good teacher." At the bottom, she'd drawn a small scale of justice, balanced perfectly. She pinned the letter to her office bulletin board, right next to her law degree. Life moved on, as it always does. The officer's trial dragged through the courts, delays, motions, appeals. But the outcome was never really in doubt. They'd been caught not just by her, but by their own arrogance. Eventually, they pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for testifying about departmental practices. It wasn't the full accountability she'd hoped for, but it was something. And in a system built to protect itself, something is often the best you get. She never went back to wearing hoodies in public. Not out of fear, but out of awareness. She knew now that clothing, skin color, posture, things that should mean nothing, could still be twisted into suspicion by someone who wanted them to. That knowledge didn't make her bitter. It made her careful and determined. Sometimes, late at night, she'd think about that evening walk from the library, the ordinary moment that turned into a nightmare. She'd wonder what would have happened if she hadn't been who she was. If she'd been a student with no connections, no federal ID, no legal training. Would she have taken the plea? Would she be on probation now, carrying a record that followed her everywhere? Would anyone have believed her? She didn't know, and that uncertainty haunted her more than the arrest ever did, because the real story wasn't about her courtroom victory. It was about the countless others who never get one, the ones whose truths are never recorded, whose evidence is never preserved, whose voices are never heard beyond the walls of a precinct. Her case was rare not because injustice is rare, but because justice, in cases like hers, almost never shows up. So she kept working. Not for headlines, not for revenge, but for balance. For the day when a young person walking home with books in their arms wouldn't be seen as a threat, but as exactly what they are, someone trying to build a better life. And maybe, just maybe because of what happened that humid evening, a few more people would believe that was possible. She still visits her grandmother every few months. They sit on the porch just like before, watching the fireflies blink in the gathering dusk. Sometimes they talk about the past. Sometimes they don't talk at all. But always without fail, her grandmother reaches over and takes her hand and holds it like a promise. Because some victories aren't in courtrooms. They're in the quiet moments after, when you realize you're still here, still fighting, still loved, and that more than anything is worth protecting.